Lawrence Connolly, welcome to the Chats and Chapters podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Great to be here, Caitlin. Thank you.
So I love starting off with how every guest kind of gets started.
Yes, I got my start writing for the magazines.
Yeah.
This was back in the 80s, and there were a lot of magazines then. It was a good time to start out as a writer, and I had been reading the magazines for a while. I was a big fan of fantasy and science fiction, and so I was reading the magazines, and kind of in the back of my mind, I was thinking, I could do this. I'd like to do this, but it wasn't
Yeah.
until the editor of Isaac Asimov's magazine, George Sithers, he started writing editorials saying that he was really hungry to see writers submit. And I started submitting to him, and he started replying. Now, he didn't buy the stuff, but he just started replying and telling me, I think you've got promise, but you need to do this and you need to do this. And then other editors started doing that too. This was a really exciting time. And so that was kind of my MFA course. This is the way I started to learn how to write, by submitting to the magazines and getting rejections until stuff started to sell.
Yeah. So was it as shocking to get responses back then as it is now?
I
Or was that more normal back then? Do you know?
I think it was more normal back then.
Okay.
That there were fewer people trying to break in. Not that there weren't quite a few, but there were fewer, and
Yeah.
there were more magazines. And it was really it was a different landscape. It's been exciting to watch the landscape change over the last
Yeah.
40, 50 years. Not only as a writer, but as a reader, it's been interesting to watch
Yeah.
the landscape change. And now, not to say that the editors back then didn't send out form rejections. They did that too. But, every now and then there would be an editor who would take an interest, and then that became the magazine that I would send my stories to first after that. I gave myself a year. I said, I'm going to give this a shot. I'll try for a year. We'll see what happens. And I also said, I'm going to write a story a month for a year. And I actually made up a little card. It was a business card with 12 lines on one side where I would write in each story and the date that I finished it and where I submitted it to. And then on the other
Nice.
side was basically my plan: write one story a month, sell one story within a year. And,
Yeah.
the fun thing was, as a young writer, I would go to, talking to people and go to parties and things. And what do you do? Well, I'm writing. I'm a writer. Oh, yeah. Where are you published? Well, I'm not published anywhere, but I got a card.
But
Card.
I'm still a writer.
I'm still a writer.
Yeah.
Interesting was, you can't write this stuff. This stuff just happens in real life, but it sounds like it's made up. But 11 months in, the first story sold. It was the first story I wrote, and it sold 11 months later. I had given myself a year. And since I had written 10 other stories in that time, I then took those 10 stories and sent them to the same editor, and she ended up buying some more of them. So that was how I got started.
Amazing. So how
Um,
did
That
that evolve into you being a full-blown novelist, screenwriter, and a playwright?
well, it took
It's
some.
probably a long story, but
Well, look, yeah, it's long to live through it, but it's short looking back on it, because when we look back
yeah.
on our lives, we look at the high points and the low points. And there's a lot of stuff in there that's just not very interesting. But when you put the high points and the low points together, it's kind of a short story. And so, how did I get started? I did have some lucky breaks. Now, certainly, I like to think that the quality of the writing had a lot to do with it, and I'll own that. But the
Mhm.
fact is, there's a lot of people that were better than I was. But I just connected in some way with readers that about a year in, maybe a little over a year, selling stories now. And I come home one night, and my wife says, "Guy from Hollywood called." And I said, "Yeah, right." She said, "No, seriously, here's his number. He called. He wants you to call him back." Now, this was back in the days when we called people. We didn't email. And so
Right.
I called him up, and he was one of the cameramen on a television show at the time called Rescue 911. And he wanted to break out into feature films. And in order to do that, he wanted to make a showcase film for the festivals. And he wanted to option one of my stories that was in Twilight Zone magazine. And a moment ago, when you said amazing, I said, yes, that's right, because the name of the first magazine I sold to was Amazing Stories. And that was the magazine that gave its name to Steven Spielberg's short-lived series, Amazing Stories. But Twilight Zone brought out some of my stories, and those began to option to film. And that's how I got an agent. Because once I had people wanting to option my stories, I needed an agent to handle those rights. And so she negotiates the first, actually, it was he, a different agent back then, negotiated the first round of rights. And then, no lie, within a month, the former editor of Amazing Stories gets back to me and says, oh, I'm working with a production company now. We'd like to option the story that appeared in Amazing. Now, each one of these is a paycheck. And it's a paycheck that comes in every year because a film option gets optioned every year until the film is made. And so I started getting some of these. And I'm saying, well, I'm going to stay in this game. This is what I'm going to be doing from now on. And the stories began to appear in the year's best anthologies. They began to be republished in other collections. And so it was a good life. And that's not all that I've done over the past 40, 50 years. I have also had the great opportunity to be one of the residency writers at one of the country's top MFA programs. I don't have an MFA, but I've taught at an MFA program. I've been a writer in residence at a major university, and I also have given lectures and talks. And so it's been a good life, but it's only because things clicked early on. But I'm telling you, and I'll tell all the readers or writers who are out there, it wouldn't have clicked if I hadn't tried. Yeah.
True.
And nothing
True.
happens unless you start. You can dream about it, but it's not gonna, you don't stand a chance of having it happen if you don't give it a try. And you have to be willing to take that rejection and realize that sometimes things aren't going to work, but hope that the things that do work win out.
Yeah. And I think giving yourself that year instead of saying, oh, I'll try it for a month. And if nothing happens in a month, there's obviously a very high chance that nothing for you happened in a month. But 11 months in, that one thing happened, it sold, and then it was a domino effect, a snowball effect. So I
That's
think giving yourself the time to grow within something is really important.
And there were a lot of rejections along the way,
Yeah.
certainly.
Yeah.
And there's still, there still are rejections, but I've reached a point now where I do sell virtually everything I write. But that's not to say that some of those things aren't rejected along the way. Things
Yeah.
don't come back for rewrites, that some of those things go back into the drawer and then get taken out a year later and get polished up. But so, it's not a straight path, but it's a path. The
Yeah.
destination makes it worthwhile.
Yeah. So speaking of you being a novelist and a screenwriter and a playwright, how do you do it all?
Well, the
Because
nice
that's
thing,
pretty impressive.
well, the fun thing about writing novels and stories is that I'm really pretty much my own boss when I get started. A story generally is not commissioned before I begin writing it. And it's, eventually, who knows where it's going to sell to. But the nice thing about playwriting is that those get commissioned. And once again, I was in the right place at the right time for playwriting because a lot of films that get optioned for film never get made. It's just an annuity. The writer gets paid every year and the movie never gets made, and you're never disappointed because the movie's a flop. You just get these checks until the movie's not made. But there was a film that was made, and it had been in process for many, many years, and it came out in 2019. It is called Nightmare Cinema. It is produced by Mick Garris, the producer who also produced Showtime's Master of Horror. It is an anthology show, and one segment was written or co-written by me and director David Slade. He's an Emmy Award winner. He's worked on Black Mirror, and he's done great stuff. And this had just come out. I had just returned from LA from the premiere, and I was dog tired, but a friend of mine had a play opening in the city. And so I thought, well, I should go and see the show. I should go on opening night. So I went there, and I like to get places early. I got in my seat early. The place starts filling up. And here comes this guy. He looks different from the others. He's got more of a direction to him, and he's coming right toward me. He sits down next to me, and it turns out he's the artistic director of the Playhouse. And he had been pointed out to me by someone. And he said, I hear you write scripts. Would you be interested in adapting Frankenstein for our next season? And it just so happens Frankenstein is one of my favorite books. Mary Shelley is one of my all-time favorite writers. As a matter of fact, if you Google my name and Mary Shelley, you'll probably find a TED Talk video of me talking about Mary Shelley's success. And so this was a great opportunity. I did write that. It was a good success. And so he came to me again. He said, let's do one on Poe. And so these were commissions where I was
Nice.
paid up front to adapt these works. And so that's how playwriting works. And how stories work is that I write them and I send them out and I find out who's going to take them. And generally, my work in film has been the result of someone reading something that has been published and then deciding to option it and then hopefully somewhere along the line releasing it as a film.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. You bounce between so many things when the opportunities arise. I think that's really fun.
And they're not that much different. The thing that unifies everything, playwriting, story writing, script writing, character and dialogue,
Yeah.
what it is. Now, of course, in
Yeah.
screenwriting and playwriting, you don't have the endless description and the introspection that you get when you're writing a story or a novel, but the dialogue is still, it drives everything. And I really think
Yeah.
good dialogue will drive a story as well. So that's what they all have
Yeah.
in common.
I love that. I am so curious. Why horror? Did you always have an interest in horror stories and movies growing up, or was there a moment that pointed you down that path?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not really a horror fan. I do like horror. I do like the good stuff, right? But I didn't
Yeah.
grow up as a horror fan. I would watch a scary
Okay.
movie and enjoy it, but I like the science fiction films and I like the science fiction stories better. I was more of a sci-fi kid. And so I was reading a lot of science fiction and watching a lot of science fiction. And some of the things that were most formative were the stories and the television shows that crossed over. They were kind of
Yeah.
dark science fiction. Think the original Twilight Zone or the original Outer Limits. And so those were things I really liked best, but primarily it was science fiction. So I wrote these science fiction stories for Amazing Stories, and then the editor rejected one because it was too horrifying. There was too much horror in it. And so at the time, this new magazine, Rod Serling's Twilight Zone magazine, comes out on the scene. And I decide, well, I'll send it there. And I sent it there and
Yeah.
they took it. And so I decided to send them the next one. And the next one was a straight out ghost story. So that's kind of how I made the transition. And then in no, not 18, I'm not that old, 1986, Harlan Ellison writes this essay in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction that is titled Horror is Dead. And after a 6-year wave where everything anybody is writing in horror is basically selling at that point, and we can thank Stephen King for that. He really opened the floodgates.
Yeah.
At that point, there was a saturation, and Harlan Ellison predicted it. And horror really began to fade fast. And there was also this implosion in the magazine field and even in science fiction. There was a bit of an implosion at that time because things had been going gangbusters for a while. And I saw the writing on the wall, and that's when I began to get into lecturing and teaching. And that has turned out to be a nice other job that I do
Yeah.
that saw me through. So to answer the question why horror, started doing it and I started getting success at it. And the horror that I like is more psychological.
Mhm.
Big fan of the slasher stories, although occasionally an exception comes along that knocks me out. But for the most part, I like the character-driven, surrealistic, strange, weird stories.
Yeah. I love that. Are you still currently teaching?
I am not. No.
Okay.
I did do that TED Talk on Mary Shelley, and I did just yesterday, I got invited to be the keynote speaker at a writer festival. So I do still get out there, but no, I have enough work. Oh,
Yeah.
I shouldn't say that because again, I was at a high school last month talking to students, and I'm going to a high school again next month to talk to students. These are all paying gigs. So
Yeah.
you know what? Answer your question. Sure, I'm still doing it.
Yeah.
I'm
Still, just not every day in like a Monday through Friday session.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it sounds like you definitely never get bored.
Never get bored. No,
No.
really get a kick out of meeting the young writers. There's so much out there. I mean, we are in a good place when it comes to people with creativity and vision and drive. I meet a lot of young writers who really got it. As a matter of fact, I wish I had their ambition and their ideas when I was their age. I didn't really get into this until I was in my 20s. And I've been meeting some 17, 18-year-olds recently who are just
Hmm.
really knocking me out. So things are looking
Nice.
good for fiction.
Yeah, that's exciting. I want to get into a little bit of your writing process. I heard in one of your other interviews that you mentioned the process of writing mysteries backwards from Mary Shelley's father. So is that how you write your books, or does it depend on the book?
Yes,
Or is that just something that you think is interesting?
I've tried doing that,
Yeah.
tried writing things backwards, and it doesn't always work. I usually just go to the beginning, but I was doing a mystery podcast during COVID. This was a time when the theater shut down, and one
Yeah.
of the artistic directors at a theater that I had been writing for wanted to keep producing stuff, but he couldn't
Yeah.
do it on the stage, so he decided to underwrite a podcast. And so I did this podcast called Prime Stage Mystery Theater. And the very first episode, or the very first 5 episode mystery, was one that really required me to get to a trick at the end, the solution at the end. So I knew the
Yeah.
solution going in. It was a locked door mystery. I knew the solution. I didn't really write the ending, but I had it in my mind. I knew exactly where it was
Yeah.
going to go. And then I wrote it straight through. So yes, that was William Godwin was Mary Shelley's father, and he wrote what is considered one of the first, if not the first, contemporary mystery thriller. It was called Caleb Williams, and it has a
Hmm.
twist at the end. And he wrote it supposedly backward. Now we read it, and by today's standards, it's very pedestrian, and you can sense the writer behind the scenes pulling the strings. He really seems to be just working to hit his beats. I shouldn't criticize my elders in the field, but people who seek it out might find it is not as rich as some of the thrillers that we have today. But he's the one that taught us how to do it. But more often than not, what I like to do is I like to start with an idea and a general sense of where I'm going. So that much, yes, I am writing with the ending in mind. And then I will lay out what I think are maybe a dozen or so really interesting twists or bits of action or interesting things that I want to happen in the story. I'll kind of lay those out on index cards, although these days I do it on digital index cards. And then I start writing. Now, as I write, I maybe get 2 or 3 index cards into the story and I'm going somewhere else.
Yeah.
Reason is because the characters are leading me in a different direction.
Hmm.
I don't know if you saw, did you happen to see, very few people saw this movie. It was Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis. Did you happen to see that?
I did
It
not.
was in the theaters very short time, and it's generally considered a flop, unfortunately, but it is a very odd film. Anyhow, here's a story. Shia LaBeouf, right?
Mhm.
Crazy, troubled actor in some ways, but a very interesting guy in other ways. He's in the movie, and he's in the movie
Okay.
with John Voight. And you have the director, Francis Ford Coppola, sitting in his chair, and this is in the documentary called Megadoc, which is based on the shooting of the film. And Francis Ford Coppola is saying to Shia LaBeouf, just do it like I wrote it. Just do the scene like I wrote it. And Shia is pushing back. He's saying, no, 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 no. I shouldn't go in and sit down. I should go in and stand up and deliver my line. And they get into this huge argument. And then finally, Coppola says, oh, go ahead and do it your way. And he does. And it's brilliant. And that's what my
Yeah.
characters are always doing to me. I'm always pushing back on them. I'm always saying, "No, I have a card coming up. You have to hit the card." But they're saying,
Yeah.
"No, man, we're going this other direction because it's cool." And I finally say, "Okay, let's let the character take me there." And
Yeah.
I do that, and I go someplace interesting, which requires me to throw out my outline, but it makes me go into a much more interesting place. And
Yeah.
so that's probably more along the lines of how I work with the ending in mind, the ending
Yes.
partly written, but
Okay.
really trying to tough it through from beginning to end.
Yeah. That's a good process. I like it. I know a lot of authors who will just start writing and they have no idea where it's going to end. And my brain cannot compute that because you don't have a direction. I mean, I love it. It obviously works. They write their books and they're great and they get out there. But yeah, I think at least having some sense of direction for the ending and then, however you get there is however the characters want to get there.
Yeah,
But at
aren't
least knowing kind of where you're going.
that's right. Aren't writers that can do that? They're amazing, aren't they?
Yeah.
We call them pantsers, right?
Yeah.
Authors.
I'm
And
like, how do you know when you get to the end if you don't know what the end is?
that's
You just
right.
write forever.
Yeah, I can't do that. I have to
Yeah.
know where I'm going. Otherwise, I'll just be writing endlessly and I'll write myself into a hole. Here's
Yeah.
another comparison to filmmaking. Stanley Kubrick was well known for shooting a scene over and over and over and over again. And the actors would say to him, "What are you looking for?" He said, "I don't know, but I'll know it when I see it. Now do it again."
Mhm.
And that's kind of the way I work as well. I will write a scene and then I'll write it again and then I'll write it again. And I will save all of these scenes, much as a director will save takes on a
Mhm.
film. And I gradually will get the scene to where it just seems natural. The characters are doing what seems natural. They are advancing the story. They are acting within character. They are delighting me with the things that they're doing and saying. And eventually I'll get to the point where I'm not saying to myself, okay, this is good enough. Let's move on. But I'll say to
Yeah.
myself, yeah, this is it. So you
Yeah,
got
that's
this,
it.
writers have this sense. They know when something's working, but writers can also trick themselves into thinking something's working. So I try not to let myself get tricked. I try to keep working on a scene until it's where I want it to be, and only then do I move on. But when I move on, I'm sure I'm in a solid foundation and that the story is going to progress well from there.
That's good. That's good. I work with a lot of first time new authors, and it's very common for them to tell me how they hate the revision process. Writing is so much fun. The first draft is a party. And I heard you say you love the writing process, but you really enjoy going back and cutting and polishing. Could you give us any words of wisdom or a different way of framing revisions for any writers or authors listening who are just not having a good time right now?
Sure, it's kind of like a relationship, you know? You meet someone, you hit it off, you're having a great
Yeah.
time. It's great. Beginnings of relationships are fantastic. You don't know where the relationship's going. You don't know if you're going to really see this person again or many times again, but you're just having fun in the relationship. And then the relationship starts to click. And then it comes to a point where you actually need to work on it. You need to make sure that you're doing things that interest both of you. And so growing a relationship is different from starting a relationship. And so when I start a relationship with a story, that first time I sit down and I start to write, it's like meeting someone new. It's magic. It's like falling in love. But you can't stay there. I mean, a relationship can't stay in that first phase forever. It has to move through the difficult stuff. And the advantage is you move through that difficult stuff, you might just find yourself in a long-term prosperous relationship, but it's going to be all right at the end. But you got to work through that trial and error stuff. And so it is quite understandable that writers become infatuated with that first draft, with that first time through. And they should enjoy that and they should savor that. And then they should say, okay, now the work begins. Yeah, I'm going to fall in love
Hmm.
again. There's going to be a first draft again. I'm going to write another story after this. But right now, I'm invested in this story and I'm going to make it work. So whether it's a marriage or raising a kid or getting along with your parents, it is always sometimes a slog to make it work. But I think it pays
Yeah.
off in the end.
That's such a good comparison. That makes so much sense. Were revisions always something that you enjoyed, or did you dislike them at the beginning of your career and now
No,
you understand the importance?
no, I always like them.
Yeah.
I tell you what, I get a little apprehensive, more so now than I used to, but I've always gotten a little apprehensive when I start something new. I know I'm going to have fun once I get going, but just staring at that blank page
Yeah.
and knowing I've got to come up with some ideas. Now, this doesn't take long. I mean, once I get started on that first draft, it just goes, right? But there is that, sense at the beginning where I'm not really sure what's going to happen. But after I've written that first draft and I've got this foundation, I have something I can work with. Here's another analogy that I sometimes fall back on. The film The Agony and the Ecstasy is about Charlton Heston playing Michelangelo. There's a scene early on in the movie where this block of marble gets delivered to Florence, and Michelangelo goes up to the block of marble and he embraces it and he says, Moses is in here. All I have to do is set him free. Cut away
Yeah.
all the pieces that aren't Moses, and I will have Moses. Writing is like that with one big difference. The quarrymen don't quarry our block of marble for us. We have to
Hmm.
write the block of marble ourselves and then cut away all the pieces that don't quite work and end up with our Moses. And we also can do something that the statue maker can't do. And that is, if we knock out the wrong piece, we can put it back in, or we can put in
Yeah,
something better.
that's true.
Michelangelo couldn't do that. He had to get that hit right the first time when he was whacking that
Yeah.
mallet. He had to get it right.
That would be stressful.
Yeah. So I think making our blocks of marble and then working on them, really, the shaping of the story is very, very important. So any writers who find that challenging, I would encourage them to try to foster an appreciation for that process. And
Hmm.
if it doesn't work for them, it doesn't work. We're all different. But I do find more often than not that writing, to get back to the cliche, is all about rewriting.
I always push my authors to do multiple rounds of revisions because I think obviously they're the ones who wrote the book. They had the idea, they created all the characters, everything. I always tell them, you're the best person to decide when this is what you want it to be before you get beta readers, before you get an editor, anything, before anyone else's opinion filters in your brain. It is your job to go through and make sure that this is the best that you can make it and how you want it to be. So revisions are so important.
That's
But I
right.
know so many people hate them. And I'm just like, no, it's so fun to pick it apart. But that's why I'm an editor and not a writer.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about making sure it's your best effort before you share it with someone, because you only get one chance to make a first
Yeah.
impression on a reader. And if you have this favorite reader that you're writing for, when you show it to them, you've given away the story, or you've given away the really cool stuff. And maybe the cool stuff is not framed the best way possible, but you've still given it away. They're never going to be able to
Hmm.
read it in the same light. So
Yeah.
get it as slick and as tight as you can, and then share it with your reader and astound them.
Yeah.
And they're still going to have things. There's still going to be things that you didn't see that are going to have to be improved on.
Hmm.
But then when you get that feedback, more often than not, it's stuff that you didn't know was coming. When you give a very rough draft to a reader, they're pretty much telling you the stuff you already know. But when you give
Yeah.
a draft you've really worked on and gotten it as best as you can get it, the reader's going to give you things that are going to be insights, things that you hadn't anticipated, and you're going to be better
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah. 1,000%. Okay. So I would love to circle back to your TED Talk because I did watch that. And I would love for you to maybe give us a brief synopsis of the TED Talk because I want to ask you about Mary Shelley's resilience.
Yes, well, as we know, Mary Shelley was 18 when she wrote Frankenstein, but what we have to remember is that she was an 18-year-old woman living in a man's world. The men were novelists. Now, there were some novelists then, but they were writing romances and comedies, but she wanted to write something completely different, something nobody'd ever tried before, man or woman. And so she writes Frankenstein. She can't get it published. She sends it off, and it comes back within 3 days. So she sends it off again. And it finally sells under the condition that she is only paid a very small percentage of the book sales. And her name is not allowed to appear on the book because, he's a woman. So the book comes out. It's not a success. A year later, booksellers are still trying to unload it. And so she starts working on her next book. And the next book is not a success either, but she never gives up. And this is just remarkable how she did that. She's poor, living in Europe, and she gets a letter from home. It's 5 years after Frankenstein was published, and she is told in the letter that there is a version of Frankenstein being staged in the London theater, the London Opera House. And she didn't write it. Back in those days, novelists did not need to give their permission for
Yeah.
playwrights to adapt their work.
It's
And
crazy.
she goes home, and the play is a raging success. Everybody is talking about Frankenstein. Everybody wants to get a hold of the original book. And she writes to her friend at that point, lo and behold, I found myself famous. And here we are, 225 years later. And Frankenstein is one of the most well-known works of fiction. Mary Shelley is one of the most well-known writers in the history of literature. And it wouldn't have happened if she hadn't defied the odds and pushed back against this male-dominated profession, decided she wanted to be a writer who would write something no one had ever written before. And if she hadn't kept it in the mail, she hadn't stuck to it. Yeah, it's an amazing story. And we are all like that when we begin. We're unknown. We're completely unknown. People have no faith in us. They don't even care about us. We have to make them care. And she certainly did
Yeah.
that. Yeah. When when
Yeah.
when the play was a success, the book was put back into print and it sold like
Yeah.
gangbusters. Hasn't been out of print since. There's
Yeah,
there's
no.
more in the TED Talk, but that's the nuts and bolts. So that's basically the story. And I always like to go back to that when I think I'm in a hole or things aren't working out well.
Yeah. Where do you think she found that resilience? Any idea?
Yes, well, she was a bit of a rebel, and
Yeah.
and she had to. This might be it, Her mother died. She never knew her mother. Her mother died giving birth, and her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, and her mother was, a feminist, very first feminist. She was writing the first feminist literature, and Mary got to know her mother not by knowing her mother personally, by reading her mother's work and emulating it. And her father was also a writer. And so she saw in both her parents that people could do this. And then her significant other, soon to be her husband, Percy Shelley, was also a writer. And their friends, Lord Byron and John Polidori, were also writers. She was surrounded by people who were doing it.
Mhm.
And she saw that they were doing it. And because her mother had done it, she knew it was possible. And also because she was a solitary child growing up in her father's bookstore, reading books, she had a determination that
Yeah.
she could be part of that world. That might have been it. It's complicated. We're all complicated, aren't we? But if I could just
Yeah.
distill it down to what I think was going on, that sounds like that might be it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think writers these days need a little more resilience?
Because there is so much of an opportunity for instant gratification.
Yeah.
Write a 30-word tweet or a 30-word Facebook post and I put it up there and I get dozens or hundreds of likes. What do I have? I'm great. I'm a successful writer. People are really digging
Yeah.
me. We need to know that when we write that first page of the story, we don't have to get a bunch of likes on that first page. We don't even have to share it with anyone. We just have to
Yeah.
keep going, long run now, to get that story finished and to eventually get it out there. And maybe in a year, the story will be published. I mean, if we're going traditional, if we're not going traditional, it might come out sooner. The
Yeah.
story might come out and we might finally get some accolades. And talking about traditional versus this new way to write, I think it's very exciting how young writers today, some of them are going on Substack and really just starting it out, making it happen on their own,
Hmm.
getting subscribers on their own, writing. A number of people have gotten traditional contracts that way.
Yeah.
So, but still, the things that the successful people are putting up on Substack are things that they are working on, putting them
Yeah.
up as tweets, as something just off the cuff.
Yeah. There's thought process behind that and
Right.
everything. So, continuing kind of the Frankenstein conversation, can you explain your idea of Frankenstein being an allegory for writing a book? I think this is fascinating, and I would just love to hear your thoughts on it more in depth.
That's right. So Mary Shelley's book is a monster story. It's about a man who creates a monster. But I think, for me anyhow, it's an allegory for the writing process. And whether Mary Shelley was doing this consciously or unconsciously, I think that she, as a writer, knew that what we do is we take these bits and pieces of things and we put them together and we hope that they come alive. And when they come alive, we suddenly realize that they're not exactly what we anticipated. And
Yeah.
readers of Frankenstein, if they go back and read that book, they will see that what happens with Victor Frankenstein when he creates the monster is not that he thinks the monster is literally hideous, but that he thinks the monster is not what he had in mind. And if we look at the description of the monster in the book, it's not ugly. Basically, it's muscle bound. It's very strong. It has this beautiful rock star hair. The hair is actually called luxurious in the book. It has these pearly white teeth. It is an incredibly good looking, 8 foot tall, muscular human. But Victor looks at it and he says, that's not what I meant. And how many writers have written something, stepped back from it, got and said, that's not what I meant. What is
What I
this thing?
meant.
This is hideous.
Yeah.
And then what sometimes happens is that thing sells. And then the writer looks at it in print and says, what is it? Did I write this? Oh my God, this is awful. But it's too late because it's out there on its own
Yeah.
and it's shaking up the world without you. You can't
Yep.
rope it in anymore. Victor can't control his monster anymore because it's out there doing its thing and it's making impressions. And some of those impressions are good and some of those impressions are bad. Victor has no control over it. But what he does is the mistake that no writer should ever make. He disowns his creation. He completely disavows it. He doesn't do anything to nurture it. He doesn't do anything to promote it. And because of that, the thing comes back to haunt him, makes him miserable, and he dies a failure. Whether or not the monster actually kills him, the ending of the story is open to interpretation. I believe, I should go back and look at it. Listeners can clarify this on their own if they want. I believe when we last see the monster, he is kissing Victor Frankenstein, bidding his father farewell. And that shows us that Victor completely misunderstood his creation. His creation
Yeah.
loved him, but Victor did not love the creation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that I think is the way that the book is a metaphor for novel writing. And when the director of Prime Stage asked me to adapt Frankenstein, what I thought was the only way to do this justice is to write it as it is to put this allegory right in front. So what I did is I had Mary Shelley in the opening act, and she's with her fellow writers, and they're challenging her to a writing contest. And then the rest of the play is Mary Shelley moving through the mansion of Lord Byron and imagining the pieces of this story as they're coming about in her head. And so the story that I wrote, the Frankenstein adaptation, very much puts the allegory front and center.
Yeah. It's so spot. It makes, when you explain it like that, it makes so much sense. I don't know if she, like you said, I don't know if she did that on purpose or not, but I'm like, oh yeah, that she had to have meant that. I'm going to believe she meant that
That's
because
right.
it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And of course, writing is a two-way street. We are as much part of the writing as the writer. The reader is as much, and so the writer owes it to the reader to put everything that he can put into the story to make his or her thoughts clear. But ultimately, it's going to be that reader that runs with it. If you've left something
Yeah.
ambiguous, which is not a bad thing in a novel to leave something ambiguous,
Yeah.
but if you leave something ambiguous, the reader may very well run with it and fill it in with something you never anticipated.
Yeah. It's so true. I saw that you collaborated with 9, maybe 10 other writers on some Sherlock Holmes books.
Yes, I didn't so much collaborate with them as we just all wrote stories. Each one of us wrote individual stories. So these were collections that were put together by Charles Prepelic, and the other editor's name will come to me in a moment. But Charles was the one that I worked most directly with. And these were through a publisher called Edge Science Fiction. I met Charles at the World Fantasy Convention in Calgary in 2007. At that point, he said he was working on this book of Sherlock Holmes stories. Would I be interested in writing one for him? Maybe a dozen other writers submitted.
Yeah.
The book came out. It is called Gaslight Grotesque. Then there was another anthology a couple years later called Gaslight Arcanum. And I had a story in that as well. Incidentally, that story is not only feature Sherlock Holmes, but it also features the Frankenstein monster.
Okay.
What is it called? The Executioner. And it is in a collection
Okay.
called Gaslight Arcanum.
Okay. Yeah. I was curious how that process worked because I saw them and I was sad when the first one's not available in paperback, but the other 3 are. So I was curious if it was an anthology is a collection of short stories. So I wasn't sure if it was that or if y'all collaborated and like passed off chapters. I was like, how did that work? That would be wild. But I guess it would be fascinating.
I don't think I could do that. I'm not a good
Yeah.
collaborator. I worked with my brother on a project, but basically he came up with a concept and I ran with it. But for the most part, I'm much too into myself to be much of a collaborator, I'm afraid.
I feel like we are the same on that level. I'm like, I don't want your opinions. Thanks. But yeah, so do they follow the original Sherlock Holmes or did you do a darker, more sci-fi twist within those stories?
And my stories were darker, more sci-fi. It had to do
Okay.
with Sherlock Holmes solving a mystery by watching a film. And of course, the Sherlock
Okay.
Holmes stories take place in an age when the film projector is being invented. And so there is this piece of film that shows what might be a murder. And Sherlock Holmes has the opportunity to run it backward and forward in order to solve the murder. It's called The Death Lantern, is the story. And the second one is The
Okay.
Executioner. And it has to do with Holmes waking up in a strange mansion where everything is oversized. The furniture is too big, the rooms are too big. It was as if this mansion was built for a monster, for a giant. And then we
Oh, I
discover
see.
that the resident is, in fact, the creature that Mary Shelley wrote about in Frankenstein. Immortal,
Cool.
right? The creature in Mary Shelley's book never dies. Here's the ending of Mary Shelley's book. The monster says, I'm going to go out into the frozen waste and I am going to burn myself to death. Right. Where's he going to find the wood? Yeah. How is he going to
Right.
burn himself to death in the frozen north? And so I suspect that the creature at the end of Mary Shelley is just saying that to kind of placate
Hmm.
the people on the boat. He's on a boat in the middle of the
Yeah.
Arctic. I'm going to leave you guys today. I'm going to go burn myself. You'll never have to see me again. But of course, what he did do is he moved back into civilization, and because he was able to manipulate things in a certain way, he was able to move into a castle and take it over and send people out to do his bidding and eventually become kind of a baron, a reclusive baron. Well, this is the premise anyhow of
Yeah.
The
I
Executioner.
like it.
Yeah. That's where Sherlock Holmes
Love
finds
that.
himself.
Yeah. I love that. When I came across that, I was like, oh, because I love Sherlock Holmes. I figured you had a good twist on it, and I was so right. So, to wrap up, if you could collaborate with any author, living or dead, who would it be and why?
Wow. Okay. You know what? I'd go for it. If I could collaborate with Mary Shelley, I think that'd be a blast.
Okay.
I would love.
Yeah.
And you know what? You know where I'd like to be? I would like to be at Villa Diodati, which was Lord Byron's mansion in Switzerland on that rainy night in the
Hmm.
summer of, let's see if I get the year right, 1860. If I could be there, one of the writers, and then all the other writers go off to write their stories. And Mary Shelley goes off and writes Frankenstein. I would like to be the guy that says, Hey, Mary, can I tag along? Can we work on this together? That's
Yeah.
what I want to do.
There you go. You can pick your level of collaboration. I'll allow it.
And
Amazing.
then the next morning, famously, the
Yeah.
next morning, they all got together and said, Well, we have stories. Let's tell them tonight. That night, Mary and I would tell the story together. That's right.
Yeah.
Then when the book came out, neither one of our names would be on it, right?
Yeah.
Right.
No, but that's okay. You would have the memories and it would be fine. Yeah. I figured that would be your answer. That's what I ask every author at the end of, but I thought there was a possibility that you could throw me a curveball
No
and I would
curveball
have been
here.
shocked.
Just a
Yeah.
nice, slow underhand pitch.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and chatting with me.
This has been a blast.
This has been a delight.
Thank you so much. And if people are interested, they can certainly find me at lawrenceconnolly.com. And they can certainly find my newest book, which I wrote based on an idea that my brother created, titled Minutemen Execute and Run. It's on Amazon. They can check it out.
All of the links will be in the description. So
Fantastic.
go check
Great.
you out for sure.
Thank you,
Yes.
Caitlin. This
Thank
has been
you.
a blast. Thank you.